Welcome to Conversations from the Continent with the Movement for Economic and Social Development in Africa, MESTA. This is a platform where we engage with Africa's most inspiring thought leaders, professionals, and doers that are driving transformation on the continent. On this podcast, we tell African stories, discuss solutions for African challenges, and shape positive African narratives to mentor and inspire our listeners. On this season, we will cover a wide range of topics across different fields, including entrepreneurship, healthcare, activism, nonprofit work, entertainment, climate change, and politics. My name is Meamande Wamukwamba, and I am your host. Our guest on today's episode is Dr. Moliehi Shale, a research expert with extensive experience in the field of climate change adaptation, primarily in the water and agricultural sectors across Africa. She is also the founder of NalaPayGo Ltd, the first female African-led pay-as-you-go energy and servicing company. Moliehi, welcome to Conversations from the Continent.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you. So we have an icebreaker usually on the show where we ask what your name means. So what does Moliehi mean? And what does Shale?
Okay, so I don't think I know that I don't think there's a meaning to my surname. Or if there is, I'd have to go and find out, but I don't know. My name, however, means a latecomer. So I was born past my due date. Yes. So you would probably, you're Lozi speaking, so I think you guys have a similar word for late coming or late comer. So I was actually Odiehi, yes. So the expected due date, yeah, I passed it. I was having too much of a good time in there. And, my poor mother had to, wait a bit longer than she had anticipated.
I've never actually thought about it like that. Like I've never actually your name like that. And that's the difference between Lozi and Sutu, because we pronounce the L as L, Li.
Mm-hmm.
Pronounce it as D, like D.
Yes.
Interesting.
Yeah. Yes. So I'm a latecomer.
That's another thing we have in common, because I was also overdue by a few months.
Really?
I was like literally almost 10 months in the womb. So
oh my gosh.
I understand. So yeah, thank you. Welcome to the podcast. I'm excited to unpack. We can't go into everything that you have going on, otherwise we'll be here the whole day. But I'll hand over to you first to kind of tell us a little bit more about yourself and your journey so far, and kind of what inspired you to pursue a career in energy.
Okay, yes. So again, thank you so much for having me. I have followed this platform, and I really, really am excited about its intention, and always really curious about some of these problems, and get really excited about how people are kind of navigating them and trying to contribute to their solutions. And ironically, I suspect a lot of people are like me. You don't realize that you're also making your contribution in some significant way until someone calls you to a conversation about what you do on a daily basis. So thank you for that also. It's just a really nice reminder that, it is meaningful, it is needed a contribution, and it feels good to be reminded of that. So, as you said, Maya, I'm originally from Lesotho. I've lived in Zambia now for...
Sorry, we lost you a bit there.
Slightly over 10 years.
We lost you a bit there. You said you're originally from Lesotho, just for the benefit of our listeners. Yeah, if you could just...
Yes. It might sound better now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I'm originally from Lesotho, and have lived in Zambia for just over 10 years now. So I consider myself a Zambian now.
Because
Um, yeah, I'm not going anywhere. Um, and my early training, academic training, was a bit removed from what I do now. So I started off as a town and regional planning student in my undergraduate days. And then sadly, wasn't accepted to do postgraduate studies in what I had really wanted to do, which was environmental management, and rather got accepted into a humanities program around uh, sociology and environment. And I was distraught, but I thought, you know, better to be in Cape Town than to be in Lesotho doing nothing. So I went to the University of Cape Town, and while I was working on an honors degree, I got an offer to do a master's degree. And then yet again, I followed and thought, better to be in Cape Town doing this that I don't particularly love, but perhaps it will get me to my ultimate goal.
Mm,
And then fast forward 2 years later, I fell in love with the whole sort of program area. I was also really fortunate that my studies were in a faculty that was very heavily focused on climate change issues, and very quickly kind of started doing or taking a lot more of an interest in adaptation and mitigation issues. And cut a long story short, went into a PhD program, and the focus of my PhD was on the adaptation of low income communities to climate change impacts, and how people use their social capital to respond to threats. So I did this work in Cape Town, where in urban low income communities, flooding is quite prevalent.
mm,
Um, and I looked at how they use burial societies to mitigate those impacts, and just generally how where do you pull on support or help when the state is unwilling or unable to offer you a service of protection.
mm,
So that question has kind of followed me everywhere I've gone in most of the work that I've done, um, which again I consider a huge blessing because I really do like it. I'm still very curious about that topic and the different ways that uh, human beings uh, connect and huddle together when there is a threat.
right.
Um, so that's how I've ended up here. Um, in as far as my professional training is concerned.
Mm,
Um, I I I went into the energy sector by accident. I kind of feel like a lot of what I've done has been quote unquote by accident. It was never intended that I ended up being in the energy sector. And how that came about is when I initially came to Zambia, it was in support of a partner who was setting up a renewable energy company. And I started doing work around that, um, and got to know it a bit more intimately. Like, how do you service low income communities? What are the dynamics of, uh, payment systems, provisioning, back end support, and so forth? Learned about the product. Um, And what I was doing, one of the roles that I was playing in the company at the time was resource mobilization. So I consider myself a really good proposal writer. I think I do a very good job of telling a story
So,
to get money out of people's pockets.
That's a skill. That's a life skill right there. That is a
I
life.
think I do. I think I do a pretty good job. So there was a funder who we had successfully gotten a grant from, and then so they had sent out another call for grants, and I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to try this business model that we've worked at here in Zambia in another market? So that's how NalaPayGo came about. We got a grant and went and set up a renewable energy servicing company. And that was in 2019.
Mm.
2018 rather, I started operations the following year. And we've been at it since. And it's been quite a ride. Um,
Yeah. It's
but yeah, I can.
interesting things that you've mentioned. And before we get into NalaPayGo, I think there's one thing
Mhm,
that two things actually. The first thing that really jumped out at me that you've spoken
mhm,
about in terms of your journey, which is something I relate to, and I think a lot of young people
mhm,
haven't realized is a thing, a real thing. It's like sometimes you have to do the things you dislike to kind of
mhm,
where you want to go, right? Because when you talk about
mhm,
journey, uh, ending up in a course or doing things, when your academic journey doesn't necessarily go the way you planned it, and I can relate to
mhm,
that because I failed quite a few times in my law school journey, and even now the work
mhm,
already tied to being a traditional lawyer, right? And I had many hard years of doing
mhm,
I didn't necessarily enjoy. But then the funny thing about purpose
mhm,
that you inevitably still end up where you're supposed to be. So that's a
mhm.
make, when I think about what you were saying about ending up in a course that wasn't what you wanted, but then here you are eventually thriving and doing the things that you love on your own terms. And I know you're doing energy.
And that I didn't know I would love,
That's a good
right? So
that's a
initially, yeah,
like you didn't know you would love, and then as you are evolving as a person, you then start understanding why things had to play out the way they did, right?
mhm,
Mm.
correct.
And before we get into energy, there's also something that I've actually learned about you for the first time in terms of what you actually specialized in. And I wanted to get your commentary
Uh-huh,
real quick because when you talk about servicing low income communities and issues of flooding,
uh-huh,
we can adapt to address these changes. Uh,
uh-huh,
so flooding is a reality. Lusaka is flooded right now. Botswana is flooding.
uh-huh,
Mozambique is flooding as we.
uh-huh,
So flooding
uh-huh,
is a real problem, and you talk about how sometimes the government may not be willing or actually able to address challenges at the scale at which they're happening. So how do
uh,
we can adapt as communities to address these changes? That's the question. But then as you answer this, I also want
uh-huh,
also kind of address the landscape that is also simultaneously shifting in terms of access to grants and access to funding, where there's is we don't really know where we are. So it's not the traditional model of saying, okay, we can apply for funding. We're still trying to figure this out as we go, but based on your experience and your expertise, do you have any off-cuff suggestions as to how our communities can adapt to all this stuff that's happening at the same time? I don't know if my question is kind of clear, but I think there's something to unpack.
yes, yes, I do understand your question, and I do think there's a lot that communities do. We're not powerless.
Mm,
I think it pains me that often when we talk about low income communities or people, their framing suggests powerlessness or lack of action. I don't think that is true. In my work, that is not what I've seen. I've seen innovation, I've seen a really high drive and desire to do better for themselves, which is a basic human thing. You
Right.
want the best for yourself and your family, and you want to be safe. Um, I do, however, think that sometimes um, they face more limitations or limits than someone in a medium income community or a medium income household may have. Um, the most simple thing or analogy to this is just our access to information. So,
Mm,
for example, Mayor, you and I hopefully know that one of the culprits of flooding in this city is how we build our homes. So
right.
there are regulations, yeah, there are regulations from the city council um, that we ought to follow, that often we don't follow. And it's in part because people don't know.
Mm,
You may not know that that wall is going to become a problem later. And the city council may not be educating you well. So if you in your urban area where the city council is supposed to be quite aggressive in ensuring your safety because it's a safety measure for everyone, is not very strong at doing that. You who have access to the internet, you who can read in English, and a lot of this information is, available in English. What more someone who's in a bit more of a remote area, who may have limitations in their reading, who may not feel very comfortable reading in English. Um, it's not for a lack of trying or agency. It's often that they just don't have information in the modalities that make sense for their reality. I
mm,
think one of the big challenges is that um, we just need to be a little bit better educated about the consequences of some of the actions we take in our daily lives,
right.
right? So yeah, so building that wall is a classical example to me about how people across the board are not very well educated, but it becomes a little bit more challenging to get information when you're uh, in a remote area or lowly educated, and those populations tend to be lower income groups, which is unfortunate because they then become even their greatest impacts are felt in lower income
Right.
communities.
I love
So,
because it's given it's given solutions that are actionable immediately. And I
yes.
in my thinking, as you were talking, I actually was thinking about how I was kind of expecting, a solution kind of focused answer, like, we need infrastructure, or because I guess that's where our thinking always is sometimes, without realizing that the
Mm,
first step is always first understanding and getting the necessary knowledge on a subject matter, which is already available, and then that makes the actionable steps, figuring out, I guess, even us as I would say civil society organizations that are trying to advance development, then that
mm-hmm,
allows us to then say, okay, if the problem is people not having access to this information or not even understanding why it's
mm-hmm,
relevant for them to know, then that then gives us our
mm-hmm.
step, right? To say, okay, first things first, let's get the information
Right.
in a way that they can consume and understand. And then
Mm-hmm.
how that begins to effect change in communities, and then make adjustments as we go, right? Would that then be some
Right.
actionable steps, something that we can do?
Yes. And in fact, there are quite a number of you know, if we're talking about climate change and mitigative actions and response, there are a lot of examples in quite a number of sectors that speak to that. That the solutions need to be like homegrown, right? If I'm
Right.
experiencing the challenge, I should be part of what that solution is going to be. I
Mm.
think sometimes, often, that's where we miss the mark. The solutions are dictated by an international funder, for example,
Right.
or the NGOs. Funding requirements are such that they focus on one particular area, and it's not necessarily aligned with what the people feeling the pinch, as you um, may see it as. So that causes quite a number of problems. One of which is ownership. You want a solution to be owned by um, uh, the people experiencing the pressure, because in the long run, they're going to hold that baton and run with it.
Right.
But there's also a lot happening around the public-private partnership. So, in quite a lot of development on a number of development issues, there's this rise in collaboration between the private sector and government, which
Mm.
is really good. I think when it's done well, it's impactful. There's sustainability there. There's contribution and participation from communities. That is really good.
Mm.
Um, but the interesting thing with the private sector, and it's a logical thing, is they often want to see a profit. So if I'm not seeing a gain in providing a solution, why would I do it? Because after all, there's still this really uh, dominant idea that some of the pressures that we are facing in the development of our nations are the responsibility of our national government. Now
Mm.
we're starting to see, like you said, that that is not necessarily um, the place where we can go to for all solutions. Our governments are overwhelmed. The landscape of development funding and support is also drastically changing, and it's really scary. But it also suggests to me that we need to very quickly start rethinking of what has worked in the past that doesn't rely on foreign aid and doesn't rely exclusively on government action.
Right.
And like I said, there's a lot that we can learn from and try and replicate to different sectors.
Mm.
So I'll make an example. I have recently been working on a clean cooking project that is meant to help stimulate the private sector. So if we want to see more um, efficient energy, more of an efficient energy mix for cooking in Zambia, and a reduction in charcoal uh, um, consumption and use for cooking, what are some of the ways that we can do that?
Mm.
And it's been really nice to start to educate banks, for example, about the potential of supporting those types of business, and the upside and
Yeah.
the revenue potential. So there are a lot of examples, but again, it goes back to educating our different sectors um, and stakeholders of potential of opportunity. So in every disaster, there's an opportunity there.
Yes.
There's money to be made.
Right.
Without losing integrity or without harm.
Mm.
But if people don't know, um, and the banks in Zambia, for example, are making uh, such a good, are having such a good running with the agricultural sector. Why should they leave it and come and support clean cooking, for example?
Right.
It is our responsibility to show them the potential.
Right.
And hopefully those learnings can then be replicated to another challenge area and then another. And I'm pretty sure I'm pretty sure there is a solution that is not going to have us dependent on government or foreign aid.
Right.
It's just that for the longest time, those have been the kind of
The
two
ultimate models. And
support. Yeah.
I think I like to talk about African philanthropy, which is something I'm super passionate about and something that we are trying to do at Mesta,
Mm-hmm.
where we have an
Mm-hmm.
African Aid for Africans project, which is basically speaking to what you were saying when you say, there's this presumption that communities are vulnerable and incapable of generating their own solutions, one, or that the
Mm-hmm.
resources that they already have are insufficient to address the problems they have, which is false.
Mm-hmm.
And something that's
Mm-hmm.
powerful about the work that you're doing, even when you talk about clean cooking, and that's something that really fascinates me, is that the work that you're doing is literally directly related to the challenges we are seeing. And, especially when you talk about Lusaka, Zambia, where we are right now, we have a problem with flooding,
Mm-hmm.
we've just discussed, and we
Mm-hmm.
have a problem with cooking because this is a domino effect from the electricity crisis, right? So there's no electricity.
Mm-hmm.
Majority of people cannot afford gas stoves or inverters or generators. So there's been a rise in the
Mm-hmm.
Ako or Malasha, as we call it. And that is
Mm-hmm.
also creating a rise in deforestation, which is then also now
Mm-hmm.
going all the way back to affecting the environment. So it's like we are in this loop. And I think that's why
Mm-hmm.
conversations like the ones that you're having, even though they may still be building momentum, like you are saying, and you're trying to get the big stakeholders to see the value of these things, I think it's important to keep having these conversations so that we can. These are the things that will actually address the problems that we're having. And
Mm-hmm.
you know, we need to quickly get into NalaPayGo, and you talked about how it's always best for the people. I'm paraphrasing, but the person that's
Mm-hmm.
experienced challenge is the best person to generate the solution. So you are the founder of
Yes.
NalaPayGo, a solar distribution company that's based in your home country, Lesotho. Tell us more about
Mm-hmm.
the work you do, and I think we'll also add quickly what challenges you faced as a woman running a business. I think as you
Mm-hmm.
mentioned, because we're behind time, you can also kind of discuss your assessment of the state of electrification in Africa and how you think it's impacting
Mm.
development.
Yeah. Um. So, I think I gave you a slight hint of how Nala came about and the opportunity we saw and kind of went for it blindly.
Yes.
Um, it helps sometimes to be naive about things because there's no fear. So
Right.
I feel like one of the things that is now prized to me, it wasn't at the time. I was crying and thinking I'd made a huge mistake when we started the business and the challenges started coming. But one of the things that I am now really grateful for was is my naivety
Mhm.
and that I didn't have fear of loss of failure. It just seemed intuitive to me that listen, you know, we can write a proposal, we can get funding towards this. There is a problem to be solved, and
Mm.
there's a market that can take up this service.
Right.
So the intention of NalaPayGo is not just to put an appliance in a home. We're quite deliberate about using the word servicing. And yet again, it comes down to the ethos that my business partner and I hold very strongly that it should not be expensive for a low income user. So we often say this, uh, in the conversations that we have around some of the work that we do, that it's really expensive to be poor.
Mm,
So poor people end up spending way more in trying to get basic services that they are human right to have access to.
right.
So what can we do to make that different? That is not a reality anymore. We change that kind of um, narrative and reality. So one of the ways that the way that we have approached it is to consider ourselves a servicing company. A servicing company, in my mind, is with you it's a long-term relationship.
Right.
I'm going to want to make sure that you understand the commitment that you're making when you buy a solar solution from NalaPayGo. I'm going to want to make sure that you have easy access to a call center or someone who knows enough to troubleshoot with you when you need to. I'm going to make sure that it's easy for you to make your payments. And I'm also going to make sure that I collect as much data about you so that I can upsell for you. So often people think that to get a solar home system that is a lighting one and migrate to a TV system and then later migrate to a refrigerator system is a tedious process that requires that at every step you buy different appliances, and therefore there's this imagined high cost. And yes, solar is still somewhat expensive. There's been huge changes in the last 10 years in terms of pricing, which is fantastic, but it is still quite a commitment.
Mm,
So our customers buy on a pay go payment plan, which means that we go into a contract. The customer makes a commitment to pay over a predefined period of time, usually 12 to 18 months. And pay-go simply means that we cut or we apportion the total cost of a system to those 12 months in days.
mm,
So whatever that equivalent is it 40 cents? Is it 1 kwacha? Is it 2 kwacha? You pay that per day. So if you are able to pay the per day rate in a week, you do so. If you are able to pay it in a month, you do so. But it really is just trying to respond to a lot of the low income economics where money is earned on a daily basis and not guaranteed on a monthly kind of calendar month, which is common for full-time employed people typically in your medium and households. So that's what we do. Our intention is to get as many homes electrified um, in Africa. We work in Lesotho, of course, but have a sister company here in Zambia and another one in Malawi. And I'm not going to go into the benefits of um, uh, or the impact that electrification may have on the continent. I won't go into that in detail, but I think you can appreciate the industrial growth and job creation or opportunities that lie on the back of electrification. Our agricultural sector is highly dependent on it and gains a lot from electrification. We have seen that in Zambia, how it's been impacted with the load shedding, South Africa similarly. There's also our healthcare services and our quality of life is impacted. Um, I, for one, still feel very abused by Zesco that I never know when I'm going to, I never know when my electricity is going to be on or off. I feel like that is very abusive of the utility. But It is our life.
It's a
And
toxic
then
relationship.
it's a very toxic relationship we have. And then one also that is very, very close to my heart is the impact on education and our human capital development. I think that African countries, and I'll speak for Zambia because I live and work with here, and I know the talent of Zambian youth.
Mm.
Um, and I'm always pained by the fact that you have really, really bright, eager learners that cannot do their homework because there's no lighting at
Ah,
night.
right.
Or, yeah, or they can't
Run
get
business.
water to bath in the morning because there's no electrification for the water pump to go on.
You
It
know,
it really pains me because we have very talented human capital in this country.
absolutely. And even when you speak about how power is impacting businesses, you know, uh,
Mm,
young people are very, very industrial and they have the
mm-hmm,
spirit is there. And I think you
mm-hmm,
yes, this since COVID, I feel like there was a very strong rise in the number of businesses that opened by Africans, young people,
mm-hmm.
whether
Yep.
it was a tailoring business. Even I opened my business during COVID. And,
Mm-hmm.
find your rhythm. And while you're still trying to find your rhythm, bam, you have this load shedding crisis, which hit all of us
Yeah.
because you find some stuff you store, you have to refrigerate to store. And you come back, I
Mm-hmm.
had
Mm-hmm.
traveled for work, and I come back and I find there's been no power for a few days.
Mm,
Yes. You have a cake business, you have you have a tailoring business, you have a welding business, a carpentry business. Before you can even
mm.
think about scaling up, how do you even scale up when you don't have access to a basic service?
Exactly.
And,
Exactly. So
and you
how do you compete?
right. And you
Mm,
use your little money to kind of as capital to actually get the business going, where
yeah.
you haven't yet gotten a customer base that can support or profits that can support, putting in industrial infrastructure,
Mm-hmm.
like, the
Mm-hmm.
solar plant or whatever. So,
Mm-hmm.
how do you scale your business? And that's why you find sometimes the multinationals have an advantage over local entrepreneurs
Mm-hmm.
because there's no framework in place to
Mm-hmm.
and electricity is like at the center of this thing that we're trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
it's a very timely conversation that we're having. And you've noticed, I don't know whether it's happening in your neighborhood, but lately there's been improved electricity supply. And we are being told to say, okay, it's because there's more water because it's raining. But then I can't
Mm-hmm.
but think, does this mean that when it gets drier, we are back in the same place? What measures, and I guess this would be a question, what measures
Mm-hmm.
can we put in place as Africans to ensure that access to electricity is not uh, it's not directly influenced by what's going on with the weather? Because when we're talking about
Mm-hmm.
change, the essence of climate change is that the weather is unpredictable. So
Mm-hmm.
we no longer have a rain season we can depend on. We no longer have a cold or dry season we can depend on. So how do we then create solutions that can address this electrification crisis we have in a way that is sustainable? I guess that's my question.
Mm. I can think of three things. I think I alluded to one earlier about stronger public-private partnerships. Again, the private sector, they're looking to make a profit. Public sector. They are meant to service us and give us these goods and services, and how they can come together so that both parties are meeting their needs or uh, the demands of their service communities. It's workable. Again, I think there's a huge role for the public-private partnerships for the energy sector. Um, that's the first one. Um, the second one is I think there are a lot of policies and frameworks around how we mitigate, how we adapt to climate change. And perhaps there's not enough around how we accelerate electrification for development to deal with those, to support those mitigative and adaptation actions, right? So, um, one of the things that I think is we do really poorly in a lot of African countries is to what's the word I'm looking for? Is to regulate. So you have beautiful policies on paper.
Mm,
You'll have departments, government departments in particular, very clear on what their mission is and what they ought to do, but very poor enforcement on the ground. So the case of that wall that is built and uh, down the line contributes highly to flooding is a classic case of beautiful, strong policy and really poor
implement.
enforcement.
Oh, yeah, right.
Yes,
Right.
yeah. So it's implementation at times. And sometimes the implementation is good, but I just think we need to do a little bit better at sustainability focused activities. So we
Mm,
have this infrastructure in place. We have these departments that understand what they ought to do. They have really capable and able human resources, but we don't have the, I don't know whether it's for a lack of financing or it's for a lack of exercising a muscle of reinforcing, but it's certainly something that I've noticed we do very poorly. And in the end, I think it it costs us a lot. And going forward, I think that's one low hanging fruit that could accelerate a lot of development setbacks.
mm,
And then another one that I found really interesting and fascinating, and I'm now curious to see how it plays out, especially um, here in Southern Africa, is regional power pooling.
mm.
You may have heard of the Southern African Power Pool, where we're trying to encourage and actually find modalities for cross-border
Right.
trade, and trading electricity is one of those. So I'd really like to see how that plays out because I think it's one of the possible solutions that would uh, you know be really impactful for different economies in one sort of effort, but
Yeah.
also for a long term. I suspect if we do it well, it would be one of the really helpful solutions
Mm.
for different countries.
It's interesting
Um,
to talk
but
about.
obviously, all of these have their respective challenges that need
Right.
to be worked out, right? Um,
It's interesting you talk about power pooling because I'm not sure whether this is not verified information because I saw it on social media.
mhm,
But at the
mhm,
peak of the load shedding crisis in
mhm,
Zambia, I saw that it
mhm.
was simultaneously announced that Tanzania, our neighbor, had
Uh-huh.
an excess of power, right?
Right.
And we were
Mm,
unable to power pool, as you call it, because there was no
mm,
infrastructure in place
mhm,
to
mhm,
actually move electricity from our next door neighbor that had
mhm,
to us that were in crisis. So, I think
mhm,
we are having conversations, and I guess that would be at a government level, maybe for them to consider when we are doing
mhm,
budget allocations. There needs to be a
mm,
deliberate investment in infrastructure. Because I would say private companies, but at that scale, you can't necessarily put up that type of infrastructure without government being involved, So,
You actually, yeah, you need
okay,
government support, but the private sector, again, where there's potential for a profit, no amount is too
big.
big, right? But
That's
I do agree that without the support and commitment of our national government, it doesn't matter how much access how much capital we have access to. We really, really need their commitment. We need their support. We need those policies aligned. We need,
right.
human capital put
Right.
there on the post to ensure that these things happen the way they are meant to, and the people who are meant to receive these services, they can without too much hardship. I think
Yeah.
for me the part of the problem is even when you see investment go into electrification, sometimes it ends up, you know going to people who can possibly find other solutions themselves,
Right.
i.e., people who already have access to some resources and
Right.
capital in solar systems and things like that.
Mm,
So where is the biggest critical need, and how do we get it there? That, I think, is a huge contribution that can come from the public sector,
And
right?
this basically
And
say of public-private partnerships and how
mhm,
the scope of that partnership can be determined on a case-by-case basis, I suppose.
correct,
Has to be
correct,
a
yes.
relationship because the two cannot thrive or manage on their own, essentially.
No, and similarly, the private sector, like I said, with all their millions, there's only so far they can go,
Right.
without the support and commitment of national governments.
Mm,
So it's this symbiotic relationship that it just has to be unlocked in ways that are profitable for the two entities. But like I said, also for the ultimate end user, because this electricity has to be consumed by someone for some developmental purpose. Identify who it is so that you provide it to them as efficiently as possible.
mm. So we're going to come
Yeah.
and come back to you personally. And
Mm-hmm.
now that we've spoken about your journey, running a business, what you're doing at NalaPayGo, and just the how you're trying to address this or climb this mountain, essentially, because it is a mountain climb,
It is a mountain. There's no summit in sight, though, it seems. I keep climbing and climbing and climbing.
What challenges have you faced as, I would put it this way. I always say this. It's a challenge to be a woman. It's a challenge
Mm-hmm.
to be black. It's a challenge to be African. Now, we are in a
Mm-hmm.
interesting position because we happen to be black African women, which is the ultimate combo, you know? Uh, and
Yeah,
that comes with specific challenges in my, from my experience,
yeah.
like there's certain things that I deal with that
Mm,
to do with the fact that I am an African black woman. And I've spoken to
mm,
a lot of women that have also had certain, there are challenges that are unique to the sector, but then there are also certain
mm,
challenges that you feel affect you specifically. And I want to unpack that a bit for the benefit of other women that are climbing
mm,
mountains right now. What
mm,
challenges are you facing or have you faced,
mm.
and how have you addressed them? Yeah, that's the question, I think.
Yeah. So another one that I want to add to that list is educated. And by educated, I'm not talking only about, book smarts and technical qualification. I think as you get older, and especially in these environments that we work in, your education stops being so much about what came out of a textbook and rather the communities that you serve and how
Right.
you do that. And that's really hard. And a lot of people don't like to do that.
Mm.
But for me, that's where the excitement and challenges are. So to answer your question, I'll give you two experiences that I've had. The first was a couple of years ago. Um, I remember I had recently gotten married at the time and went to a conference in, I believe it was Uganda, I don't remember. So this is a climate change conference. I'm, still finishing off my PhD and obviously talking to peers about, what I'm researching, what I would like to do after that. Somewhere in conversation, it was revealed that I'm newlywed, and one of the gentlemen, an older gentleman that I was chatting to, said, "Wow, um, so you're working towards a PhD, yes, and you have a husband, yes." And he says, "How did your husband allow you to attend this conference?" So,
Mm.
despite my big age at the time, I got married quite late. Despite my ability proven in, I'm working towards a PhD and I'm able to make decisions. Um,
Right.
so that for me was very telling, and has stayed with me for a really long time because I've experienced similar um, reactions to who I am, what I do in my personal life and professional life.
Right.
And then the other one was I was interviewing for a role, like a professional support role. Um, so one of the interviewers, curiously a female person, says, "Okay, so you have," she says to me, "So you have shared with us that you have two young children. I'm curious as to how you are going to juggle the responsibility here, given technical support, and your role as a mother, and your day-to-day work. Um, and it's difficult to not feel reactive to such a question because my bet is that my male counterparts that were being interviewed for the same position were not being asked about their children and how they
Absolutely.
navigate parenting and professional life and
Absolutely.
yeah. So that to me speaks to the challenge of being female and black and educated and still having a life, which I'm entitled to. I'm entitled to having a personal life.
Right.
Um, so some of the challenges for me have been that I just feel like male and female people often still think that to be a woman means that you play on a different playing field, and on that playing field, you better make sure that you don't be too good at
Right.
what you do. Always underplay your potential. Always give to other things other than where your talent or God given ability lies.
Right. And
So whether it's taking a uh-huh.
that
So
that
you'll often see it in these demands for, but if you are here, where are your children? Who's taking care of your children? If you are here, who's taking care of your home? If you're here, who's taking care of your husband? But the
Right.
husband is not asked.
Who's
If you're
taking
here for a meeting, who's
care?
taking care of your wife? Your wife needs taking care of too, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I have found those really, really difficult because it really speaks to our society and how it sometimes views us and our possible contribution.
Mm.
But that is not to say it's going to stop us. Obviously, we're here because we have experienced those reactions and we soldier on.
Yeah.
In terms of the business itself, um, the renewable energy space in Africa and perhaps especially in Southern Africa is still a bit nascent in that there's still not a lot of investment in it, particularly for startups such as my own. Um, we especially don't have enough females across the value chain. So I think that we pose quite a challenge to the community. I often feel like people don't know what to do with a female entrepreneur. They know what to
Right.
do with a male one, particularly if that male one is Caucasian, because for the longest time, they have been pioneering these types of enterprises in these types of sectors. But here comes along this young girl. Like, what are we going to do with her? Does she even understand what she's doing?
Right. Right.
When we talk the economics of the business, is she like they just
The
don't know what to do
capacity to
with you?
grasp this. Right.
Yeah, so I find that there's a lot of I call it a tax. There's a lot of there's a tax of being female um in this particular sector, in that you're constantly educating people about things that I feel are not necessarily aligned to the business. I shouldn't have to educate you on that I am educated about my business. I shouldn't have to educate you on my commitment to um, my chosen enterprise. So it becomes a bit stressful and exhausting.
Yeah.
Um, but perhaps it is necessary because hopefully all of this that you and I are going through, may our daughters won't have to,
Right.
because we would have put in the legwork and brought people up to the level where an entrepreneur is an entrepreneur, whether they're in a skirt or a pair of pants, they're
Right.
an entrepreneur. Whether they are black or white, they are an entrepreneur,
Right.
and we should be talking to them at a level of, we should be curious about what they are doing at a level of their contribution, not their physical or genetic makeup. So
Right.
that's a lot. That's really taxing. I have found it also really difficult to finance the business, and this is not particular. This is not. I don't think this is because I'm female. I think it's again something I spoke about earlier. I feel like investors um, and funding organizations. I'll talk about banks in particular because I've worked with them so much here in Zambia. I think they're still quite behind in terms of understanding this sector and its potential. So getting financing is really, really hard.
Mm.
Getting financing in Lesotho is even more difficult because it's such a small economy.
Mm.
Um, the servicing community is small. Lesotho is just under 2 million, has under 2 million inhabitants. So if I'm competing with someone in East Africa for funding in Nairobi, for example, that is doing very similar work to mine, they're going to get the money because they have the numbers that,
Right.
I quickly hit a glass ceiling
Mm.
on. So that has been really difficult. And just convincing them of the market potential and the exponential value of even that 1.8 million servicing communities has been really difficult. We still face that difficulty even now. Um, and I think it is, like I said, I don't think it's gender specific. I do, however, think that a lot of other entrepreneurs that I have worked with and seen have an added challenge in that once you start speaking to investors, it's a whole nother ball game, right? I could be the best salesperson, technician. Uh, I could be the best at what I do anywhere in this value chain. But once you start talking about investment and making those decisions on how you get other people's money to do what you do best, it's really difficult. Um, I don't know that even training is the ultimate solution, although it does help. Um, so I think one of the things that entrepreneurs need desperately is someone who can be like, you know what, you take care of the technical side of the business because you do it exceptionally well.
Right.
And I will support you in navigating this space of getting resources and mobilizing so that you can um, scale up and be the best you can be at where your God given talents are. I
Mm.
think I have struggled with that, and I know a lot of entrepreneurs struggle with that.
Absolutely. And there's something interesting that you said that I was thinking about when you were talking about the gender specific challenges you faced.
Mm,
And just I always like to say this. You There's you, the person, and then there's you, the woman. And I think
mm,
always mix the two. And I guess the tragedy of womanhood sometimes is that often you're not allowed to be an individual with ambitions and
mm,
aspirations. You must be a woman,
mm,
you must be a mom,
mm,
you must be a caregiver,
mm,
you must be, that is just a very small part of the spectrum of womanhood, which
mm.
for a long time has been classified as the only thing to womanhood, or the epitome of womanhood. So and I say
Yeah,
that when you talk about being educated, being knowledgeable, you know, it's often perceived as an attack. I've been in rooms
yes.
where you're in a room with people, and the fact that you're knowledgeable on the subject matter is literally seen as an act of war. Like you're cheeky,
Mm,
you think you're
mm.
bossy, you know,
You think you know it all?
I know it all. You talk back, and it's like, I'm not talking.
Yeah.
You are misinformed on this issue. And
Mm,
when you talk about African development and what's at stake, what we are trying to do, what we are trying to build, you know how do I keep quiet when you are misinforming the masses and the cost is high?
yeah,
And I've
yeah,
spent
yeah,
years, I've spent years, perilous years at that, acquiring knowledge, uh,
yeah.
address this issue. But because I'm a woman, and I've seen this in even some of the most quote unquote refined rooms where you would expect
Mm,
people to be highly educated people, both male and female. And I'm glad you pointed that out, because sometimes, even as we are pointing at men and saying men are making things difficult for women, women also make
mm,
things difficult for women.
Mm,
And that is
mm,
an episode that we actually need a whole episode on unpacking
that is true.
African
I agree.
and our relationship with women, woman to woman relationships, especially in professional settings, are, are very troubled. And there's a lot.
Mm,
So, it's thank you for sharing that. A lot of what you said it's hit home for me. And
mm.
we are once again, this conversation from the continent, we need more time. So I guess now is also time for us to call on any listeners who are interested in funding and supporting the podcast to reach out to us, because we are going to have to
Mm-hmm.
end here. But lastly, uh, what advice would you give to young Africans who have an interest in pursuing a similar path, or who are just
Mm-hmm.
at the beginning of a journey of finding themselves and finding a way that they can be of value uh, to the continent, to their homes, to their communities? What advice do you have for us? I've thrown myself.
Yourself included. That's gonna be a difficult one. Um, man, one of the things that I am ever grateful for in my life is that I grew up in tight communities, and it has played out even in my adult life. I've always felt like I'm part of some community. So I grew up on a university campus. I'm part of that community. In my family, I'm part of that community. In school, I've always been in environments where I felt that I was part of a community. And it's important to have those feelings that you are part of something.
Mm,
Because when things are good, you enjoy the benefits and excitement of that with other like minded people. When there are challenges, you are again with like minded people that feel a responsibility to make change. So I would say to young people, find your community, find your tribe.
mm,
Um, I don't know whether you're going to do it in the church, you're going to do it with people that you grew up with, wherever it is, find like minded people. And like minded doesn't mean we both like the same thing,
right.
but we have a consciousness and worldview that is aligned
Mm,
closely enough that if I say, man, let's go to war here and go and make an impact there, you'll be like, yes, what is required of me? I'm coming. As
mm,
opposed to, no, let the government deal with it, man.
right. Right.
Why are you interfering in spaces where you don't belong?
Mm,
So I think find your tribe um, is a big learning for me. Um, and I think also what I have seen of young people is that there's so much pressure to be doing, to be advancing, to be.
right.
And like I said, with my early, story of my academics into my professional life, I, I, I don't know that I was using my energy, putting my energy towards the right things because, as fate would have it, I ended up in a totally different space from where I thought I wanted to be or ought to be.
Right.
Um, and I am so happy that life's journey has put me where it's put me. So I just think, guys, take it easy. Your path is already written in the stars somewhere.
Yeah.
And you're gonna land where you ought to land. Just keep doing your best. None of this pressure that I need to do this by this age, I need to do that by no. I really regret that I did that to myself. And
Mm,
I would say to younger people, focus on doing your best every time at what you do And the rest just, life just has this beautiful way of unfolding, and you end up in spaces you never thought you would appreciate or like or thrive in. And
Mm.
that's the magic of it. Just
That's
have faith.
That's such
Yeah.
an amazing end, and that's amazing advice, especially having community, how it helps. And
Mm.
be close. You are somebody that I am personally very grateful for because, you are like a North Star for me in many ways. And thank you so much for taking the time. Uh, Free time because I know that you've been paying for this time. But thank you for lending a service to the continent. by,
It
by
is
the,
my greatest honor. I am so, so grateful again for this opportunity. Yeah, it's just been a really nice
it really
reflection as
has
well.
been.
So I'm very grateful that you've given me a chance to kind of think through and dig a little bit deeper.
Yeah, thank you for joining us. And we're going to end here for now. And we look forward to, I always say this because I'm speaking it into existence. We look
Mm-hmm.
having another conversation, maybe in person, so we can start doing video
Mm-hmm.
versions of this podcast at some point as we grow.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you for joining us and thank you to our listeners and talk soon.
Thank you, man. You take care.
Bye.